Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We are here to start a conversation, clearing paths, creating access, empowering youth through museum education. I'm Julie Stein. I'm the executive director of the Burke Museum, and I am absolutely thrilled that you're with us today. I'd like to start by doing the Burke Museum's land acknowledgement. The Burke Museum stands on the ancestral land of the Coast Salish peoples, who have resided here since time immemorial and thrive here today, alive and strong. Now that's the land acknowledgement for the Burke Museum. But many of you are not near the Burke Museum today. And I thought it would be interesting or fun if you could put into the chat the name of the indigenous people whose land you are on right now, thus honoring the people who were there before us. So if you want to do that, it would be fun, and I encourage you to do so. So, okay, what a year this has been. We have a new museum. Well, it's newish anyway. And we have a new educational event. We're supposed to be downtown. We're going to be in a big hotel. We're going to have breakfast together. Well, now we have a Zoom webinar at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, but it is going to be fun. We have a new education director. Dr. Alvin Logan, who you will hear from later, started his first day at the Burke Museum on March 12th, which just happened to be the same day that we closed the museum to the public. So Alvin has had a very busy time working with his team that you're going to hear more about and accomplishing amazing things. All of this newness at the Burke Museum has really inspired many of us, especially me. Everywhere I look, I see evidence of resilience, of inspiration, of hard work, of community spirit. And nowhere is it more evident than in our education team. They are knocking it out of the park. Now, you know we're open, so you could come to the Burke Museum. You could see your favorite gallery. You can see workrooms where our people are working and laboratories. You could see your favorite dinosaur. But school groups have not been able to come back to the Burke Museum. So our education team has completely renovated Burke boxes, and they are now traveling all over the state, bringing museum objects and curriculum and fun activities to teachers and students and libraries and everybody who would like to share them. We also have brand new virtual field trips. So a class, a student, a teacher, a family can actually have a field trip led by our education team, and sometimes accompanied by live people who can do questions and answers. All of this new innovation is due to your support. And you today, we're asking for your support at any level to ensure that these resources continue to be sent around the state, around our community, and that they would be available to every teacher, family, student, anyone who would like them, regardless of their ability to pay. So we're hoping to raise $75,000 this fall for our education efforts. And we're already halfway there. So big thank you to all of you who have already helped us in this effort. And we will post a link to donate in the chat during this event and hope that you will join us with a gift. Thank you so much. So now we get to hear from some amazing leaders and inspiring people. And to lead us off and start this event is Polly Olson, our tribal liaison. So Polly, I'm handing it off to you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Julie. And thank you to each of you supporting the work of the Burke. I'm Polly Olson, a member of Yakima Nation located in South Central Washington State. Today, we will hear a handful of personal stories that bring resilience, strength, and knowledge to our community. I have had many mentors in my life that continue to emphasize these messages. I will be a leader and make a better future for our people. I was told that my behaviors represent my people, the Yakima Nation. Everything I do does matter. And the most impactful message I've received as I've grown up is that I am important. I hope you can reflect on your journey as we listen today. Before we begin, I want to provide a quick overview of our program and share our Zoom rules. We'll briefly hear from leaders from each of our Burke Museum boards. We'll then enjoy a conversation between two trailblazing museum leaders. There will be about 15 minutes at the end for questions, so please type your questions in the Q&A at any time. You can also like someone else's question using the thumbs up in the Q&A, which will help move that question to the top. If you have questions about giving or the event, please put them in the chat and a Burke staff will respond. Again, for all questions for the speakers, they should go in the Q&A. Now I'd like to introduce our leaders from our boards. First, Ms. Charlotte Bash with the Native American Advisory Board. She is a member of the Puyallup and Clatsop-Nehelm tribes. She's the former Assistant Director of Cultural Education for the Burke Museum. Then we'll hear from George Counts with the Burke Museum Association Board. He served as a senior advisor on special populations in the HIV Vaccine Trials Network at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center in Seattle. He's originally from Oklahoma. He has both bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Oklahoma and a medical degree from the University of Iowa. Now I'll turn it over to Charlotte to say a few words.
Thank you, Polly, and thank you, Julie. Hat flachel Charlotte Bash seed stuts Puyallup Shud Yafti Clatsop Nehelem. Good day, everyone. My name is Charlotte Bash. As Polly said, I'm a Puyallup tribal member. I'm also Clatsop Nehelem. I currently work for the Puyallup tribe as a historic education coordinator in the Historic Preservation Department. And I used to work for the Burke Museum for a few years in the education department. So I'm very familiar with the awesome work of the education department, and I'm very excited to be here. I'm also a member of the Native American Advisory Board, and I just want to recognize all of my fellow board members for the work that they do on behalf of Native communities for the Burke Museum. I'm really excited to be here, and I just want to share a few words, about representation is so important. And I was asked to share a story about a mentor or someone that really guided me to where I am today. And I'm often asked how I ended up in the education field and in the cultural field. And I think about my first or earliest memories of education and museums, and how a lot of those memories actually revolve around frustration or confusion about not seeing my people's stories represented. And I am very, very, very lucky to have had mentors in my community and in my family that recognized that frustration and had me redirect it to make a difference in that. And that's something that not a lot of youth from underrepresented communities have. A lot of our youth turn away from education, turn away from those institutions that have that authority position because of that misrepresentation of their stories. And I was very lucky. I was told, if you don't see your story there, then why don't you go tell it? And not everyone has that opportunity and has those people to push them towards that. And so that's why I think today these conversations that we're going to have are just so important. And it's not just about talking about what we should be doing or we could be doing, but really getting those wheels turning and saying, what are we going to do starting today? As soon as we all leave this Zoom meeting, what are we going to get on the ground and do to actually make a difference in the lives of our youth? So I just want to say thank you for letting me speak for a little bit here and represent our Native American Advisory Board. I want to turn it over to George to share a bit about his story.
Thank you, Charlotte. I'm George Counts. I serve on the Burke's other board, the Burke Museum Association. I'm pleased to represent my BMA colleagues today. I believe that together we can do a better job of creating access and resources for kids, especially Black and Brown kids. I agree also with Charlotte that seeing leaders that look like you is so important. It was so for me. When I began medical school, there was only one Black faculty member. However, he was a distinguished and highly respected thoracic surgeon. His accomplishments certainly drove my own desire to also succeed. In looking back at my career now, being a mentor to young Black and Brown students was one of the most satisfying roles that I played, that is, helping to create a path. I'll now give it back to Polly.
Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you, George. Appreciate you being with us today, and thank you for your leadership and sharing your stories. And now, the center of the program. I would like to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Alvin Logan, Director of Education at the Burke Museum. He will introduce himself and our distinguished speakers today. Alvin.
Thank you, Polly. As Polly just mentioned, I'm Dr. Alvin Logan Jr., and I'm in front of you all today as the Director of Education at the Burke Museum because of my many ancestors who have sacrificed for my right to learn. Standing on the backs of giants such as Maya Angelou, Assata Shakur, Marcus Garvey, W.B. Du Bois, Langston Hughes, and Gloria Ladson Billings, I am empowered to clear paths for youth just like me to grow and appreciate the love of learning. My life and professional experiences bring me back to the words of famed author James Baldwin, as he says, "Those who say it can't be done are usually interrupted by those who are doing it." I'm proud to say that we in the education department at the Burke Museum are comfortable interrupting to create the opportunities for the next great minds to change how we interact with our world and to preserve our knowledge and heritage. Our suite of programs has shifted to honor decentralized and distance learning during this COVID time. We offer virtual tours, live streaming with our educators, hands-on learning packs, Burke from home curriculum packets, interactive cultural education sessions, gallery activities, and of course, our Burke boxes. It is through the brilliance and diligent work of our dedicated staff that we remain relevant and supportive of student informal STEAM and cultural learning. So thank you to Mary Jane, Catherine, Andy, Pamela, Devin, Caleb, Andrea, and Margaret, among many others who had a hand in making the department what it is today. I am appreciative of your excellence and your service to our youth. Now, I am excited and honored to moderate a conversation between two phenomenal individuals who have influenced youth, just as my third grade teacher, Miss Love, encouraged me to be the change that I want to see in the world. Please join us in a discussion about life experiences and the importance of museum education from our speakers. First, Dr. Lisa White, and second, Jim Pepper Henry. I would be remiss also if I did not tell you that today is a special day. Today is Jim Pepper Henry's birthday. So if you can, go ahead and show him some love in the chat. And again, just remember as we roll through this, happy birthday, Jim. I'll now turn it over to Lisa.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Alvin, for that introduction. I'm so pleased to be with all of you today, and I'm sending you greetings from the land of the Ohlone here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And it's always a joy for me to have an opportunity to talk about education and outreach and accessibility in museum experiences, because that's very much the core of what I do as the Director of Education and Outreach at the University of California Museum of Paleontology in Berkeley. And even before we were limited to virtual experiences, I've actually long been a fan of the ability for museums to share knowledge about fossils, share knowledge about objects, share knowledge about human history, because that kind of access and empowerment, it's part of the trajectory of future scientists and future museum professionals, which we hope many of you want to be. And before I came to Berkeley as the Education and Outreach Director 8 years ago, I was professor of geosciences at San Francisco State University. My background and training is in geology, paleontology, specifically microfossils, small, tiny fossils that you need a microscope to see. But I found myself as a faculty member teaching college students in paleontology classes that being able to have the opportunity to see just the range of fossils at a paleontology museum through online exhibits was really key. And so early in the UC Museum of Paleontology's use of the web, it's easy to take for granted now that we get our primary source of information from the internet. But in the early 2000s, when the web was in its infancy, the UC Museum of Paleontology was one of the first 100 websites anywhere in the world. And I think one of our claims to fame in paleontology is we were the first to put a dinosaur on the web, beat the Smithsonian to that. So go figure. But I bring that up because the ability to access information and be able to make it part of the broader interests that you might have, and really to choose a journey. So being able to not only learn about fossils that you might have as your favorite, but being able to learn about the scientists behind those discoveries is key as well as knowledge about where these fossils come from. So seeing scientists work in the field, being able to share what we see when we go to field spaces is key to sharing the love for what we do and hopefully inspiring the next generation. And now that I'm in a position where I get to create resources that we share online, we have a whole suite of virtual experiences from many places, not just in California, but places in the Pacific Northwest, specifically in Washington State. And so through that, we want to be sure that our audiences know that when we are able to do actual field work, it's a central part of the kinds of skills and knowledge that we think is fundamental to understanding our science. And speaking of understanding science, one of our popular web resources is called just that, Understanding Science. And it's a real look behind the nature and process of science. Who does science? What kinds of questions do we ask? How science benefits from diverse groups of individuals, all with different perspectives. And yes, science is always evidence-based, and we make evaluations and interpretations based on what we observe and collect. But some of the best individuals to observe things are youth. They have a keen ability to use that excitement and drive about what they see to share with their families. And scientists learn from youth all the time. When we do projects that are part of these large group citizen science projects, when I've gone out with youth to discover and look at fossils and dinosaur areas, some of the young people end up being the first to find something that's very significant. So we rely on communities to teach scientists what's important, what's interesting, what we should be asking questions about. And so I hope as we continue learning from each other today, we consider that museums would not be in the positions that they are and able to offer the wide range of programming without input from community, without the ability to constantly share resources and update and expand them with your input. And it's my pleasure to introduce and invite Jim to share remarks with you. Thank you.
Awe kage nika kage wako. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank the Burke Museum, and in particular, Julie Stein and her team, for inviting me to participate in this conversation this afternoon. I am Jim Pepper Henry, and I'm a member of the Kaw Nation, and that's a federally recognized tribe in Oklahoma. Now, Kaw is short for Kanza or Kanza, and my tribe is from what is now known as the state of Kansas. And most Kansans don't know that their state is named after my people. In fact, I used to live in Washington, D.C. I worked for the Smithsonian for 10 years. And I met Senator Bob Dole, senator from Kansas, on the steps of Capitol Hill. And I introduced myself to him and I said, I'm Jim Pepper Henry, I'm a member of the Kaw tribe. And he looked at me funny. And I said, Kaw or Kanza or Kanza. And it was amazing to me that a senator from Kansas didn't even know that his state was named after an American Indian nation, and in particular, my tribe. So I knew that some work needs to be done out there, especially how museums can further education. And really, in the case of American Indians, in many ways, we're invisible to a lot of people, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But I've been in the museum field for over 35 years. I know I was only 7 years old when I started, but I've held many different positions in the museum profession. I've been a curator of American Indian art at the Portland Art Museum. I helped my tribe build its museum in Kaw City, Oklahoma, the Kanza Museum. I helped establish the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian. Worked there for 10 years and was the associate director of that institution. And then I've gone on to other museums, but I'm now building a new museum in Oklahoma City, the First Americans Museum. And this museum will represent the 39 tribal nations that are now here in Oklahoma. And those 39 tribes come from all over the contiguous United States. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But I've always been interested in art and art history. My first museum job was as an assistant preparator at the Tacoma Art Museum while studying art history as a freshman at the University of Puget Sound. And this is way back in 1984. And that experience really opened my eyes to the inner workings of museums and how they function. And historically, museums have not been friendly places for Native Americans. For us, they've been reminders of the things that we have lost or things that have been taken from us. This includes the disinterment, storage, and study of our own ancestors in the museum setting. Our history and our cultures have been interpreted and presented in museums by people from other races, including Caucasians. And obviously, there's been a distinct cultural bias over the last 100 years with regard to the way Native Americans are interpreted in museums. Up until the mid-1980s and early 1990s, in most cases, Native Americans were not consulted or welcomed to the conversation in the curatorial process and with regard to their own histories and cultures. And when I was coming up through the museum ranks, there were only a handful of Native American curators active in the museum field, including the Burke's own James Nason. And another gentleman who was a big influence in my life was Mr. George Horsecapture, who was curator at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West in Cody, Wyoming. And I had the opportunity to work with Mr. Horsecapture at the National Museum of the American Indian. And these two gentlemen, among others, challenged the museum world to recognize Indigenous peoples as having legitimate authority to represent themselves in the interpretation, treatment, and management of cultural collections associated with their communities. And thanks to them and a few others, there are dozens of Native American curators now in the museum field. and hundreds of Native Americans working in the museum profession, including myself. And of course, a good friend of mine who works at the Burke Museum, Dr. Sven Hawkinson. And the whole approach to interpreting and managing cultural materials in museums has completely shifted in a very positive way over the past 20 years. So that's a little bit about my story, and in a little bit, we'll talk a little bit more about what we're doing here at the First Americans Museum. Thank you.
So thank you, Jim and Lisa. And if you all are like me, I am excited to hear more about their stories. As you can see, the depth of the experiences and the brilliance they both brought to those experiences, I'm just excited to dig in here, okay? So the conversation, as we have, will moderate, and I wanna start with the question for Lisa. The question is, thinking back to when you were a third grader, did you believe you would be where you are now?
Not at all, Alvin. So I grew up in San Francisco, really close to a natural history museum, the California Academy of Sciences in Golden Gate Park. And in third grade, my classrooms, my school would take regular trips to that museum. And certainly I would along with my sisters because it was so close. And I loved looking at the rocks and minerals and fossils in the cases as well as other objects, but I never associated it with a career. You know, many paleontologists, especially vertebrate paleontologists, you ask them when they realized they wanted to be a paleontologist, and they usually say third grade, you know, from the time they could, you know, enjoy picture books, they knew all the dinosaur names. So sometimes I feel a little left out of those conversations. So I think, well, that wasn't exactly me. And, you know, honestly, growing up in San Francisco in the 60s and 70s, and I have two older sisters, there were so many distractions. I was more into the arts and music. In fact, I thought in later years by middle school, I really wanted to be a photographer. I loved nature photography. I wanted to be the Black female Ansel Adams. So that was going to be, you know, my career. And so it was pretty far from paleontology, but I was just, you know, maybe subjected to a little bit of peer pressure, but it's hard to know when you're that age what you're going to do. But when we consider, and so many parts of our lives circle back, right? So circling back, I think, but you know, that early inspiration that science is so cool and that, you know, museums have value was because of a visit to a museum when I was in third grade. And so even though my trajectory might be different from other paleontologists, there's something to be said, you know, for that early spark.
Absolutely, Lisa. That's an amazing testament to the power of informal education, especially within museum spaces.
Mm-hmm.
So similarly, a question for Jim. What made the biggest impact on you in your educational and professional journey outside of school?
Well, around the time that I was in the third grade, I lived with my maternal grandparents, and they were both from Oklahoma. My grandfather was a member of the Kaw tribe from a little town called Washunga, and my grandmother was a member of the Muscogee Creek Nation from a little place called Broken Arrow, which is near Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I followed the path of my grandfather Gilbert with regard to my Native American cultural heritage, and he taught me, or as we would say, he gave me my Kaw ways. However, my grandmother Floy Pepper was perhaps the greatest influence in my life with regard to education. And she was a mighty force in the educational world, especially in the Pacific Northwest. She was the youngest woman and first Native woman to receive her master's in education from what is now known as Oklahoma State University. I think it was called Oklahoma A&M back then. And I believe she was 19 years old when she received her master's. And that was unheard of back in the 1930s. And my grandparents moved to the Pacific Northwest just before the Second World War. And they both worked at Chemawa Indian Boarding School in Salem, Oregon. My grandmother was a teacher there, and my grandfather was a cook at that school. And when the war hit, the Second World War hit, they moved to Portland. And my grandfather worked in the shipping yards as a welder. My grandmother worked as a teacher in the Portland School District and eventually worked for the state, developing and revising Native American related curriculum for K through 12 schools. And back then, if Indian education was taught at all, it was taught with a very strong bias. And so she made it her life's work to correct that and to really bring forth Native American culture and heritage in the schools and to be able to teach American Indian history in the school systems. She wrote several books. She was also an Adlerian psychologist and worked with a famous psychologist named Rudolf Dreikers. And she wrote a very famous book called Maintaining Sanity in the Classroom. And I think many colleges still use that book in their coursework. But of course, my grandmother instilled in me the power of higher education and how that education would open doors for me, especially going beyond high school education into secondary education, college and master's degree. My mother also had a long career in the education field, and she eventually became an assistant superintendent for the Portland School District. And I should also mention that my uncle, Jim Pepper, was a famous jazz musician. So I had a lot of talented people in my family in the educational world and also in music and the arts. And I continue the family tradition of developing and facilitating educational programs in the museum world. And when the first Americans Museum opens here in Oklahoma City next year, we expect to provide educational programming to over 40,000 K through 12 school kids each year. So when I was in the third grade, I had an inkling that I would have a career in the arts and or education, but I had no idea that someday I'd be director of a major museum.
Thank you, Jim. It's so much history steeped in what you said, and it was laden with a lot of different figures that definitely had an impact on you. And I think it's still, you can still feel it today, right? And the steps you take and the ways in which you engage with your work. Similarly, there's a lady by the name of Dr. Marguerite Thomas Williams, who was the first Black woman to earn a PhD in geology. And she also taught at Miners College, which was a college for abolitionist girls, which taught them how to become teachers. So this next question, off the back of understanding that history and that trajectory, is for Lisa. How does your heritage and culture guide your work?
Well, there's so many ways, and her story is so inspiring, and just demonstrate that there's so many individual pioneers in various disciplines of science, of social science, and our society, people who connected with a discipline, even when everything may have worked against them to do that. And so we continue to be inspired by those individuals. And like Jim, there's so much that I draw on from my parents and my upbringing. So my parents met at San Francisco State in the 1950s, and their fields are psychology for my dad and nursing for my mom. And my father, after receiving his PhD from Michigan State, and he was the only one who earned a PhD, African-American, in clinical psychology in 1963 from Michigan State. And when my family came back to California, my dad was professor of psychology and also dean of undergraduate studies at San Francisco State during the year that the students went on strike. So primarily led by the Black Student Union, they demanded during the 1968-69 academic year that academic programs at a public university reflect their experiences. And so it was such an upheaval. My sisters and I mean, every night, we'd watch the news. There was my dad getting caught in between the leadership on the SF State campus, which included S.I. Hayakawa, who's Japanese American, but whose family had suffered from being in an internment camp. Yet he was very conservative and really thought that people should just buy into what universities have to offer as it was then. but seeing my dad navigate that kind of change and really empower students to make a difference made me, even in my field, as different as it can be from psychology or nursing, see that commitment to social justice and civic engagement and civil rights. And as I came to geoscience and realized, I love the field, loved paleontology, and had great advisors along the way, I always knew that I wanted to also be a bit of a pioneer in my discipline and lead change, include and make resources more accessible in a discipline that continues to suffer from, I think, lack of full inclusiveness of all communities. And so again, those seeds that are planted by your family, even if they're in fields that aren't as connected, I'm certainly from a family of educators, and that certainly surfaces all the time.
Absolutely. I mean, I would love to meet your parents. They sound so interesting and like very intellectual beings. And that's a beautiful thing to grow up in a home like that, because it inculcates your culture and heritage and really empowers you to become who you are. And one thing I keep hearing you talk about pioneering. You talked about pioneering towards the end, and to be able to pioneer, one thing becomes apparent. You're the only person around that probably looks like you, that wonders about the things you wonder about. So this next question for Jim talks about identities, especially being one of the only, or really just how your identities play off the environment. And a little context to the question, in 2016, Jim did an interview about Washunga Days. And, he talked about being at home, but not being on his own land, or not feeling like he lives there. And I would argue that also parallels that what's happening in the state of Washington and Seattle for many Black, Indigenous, and youth of color when it comes to identity expression, STEM and STEAM cultural spaces. They may not feel that comfortability and feel kind of like they stick out in a lot of those places. Thus, my question for Jim, how do your identities impact the environment that you're in? And how does that environment impact your identities?
Well, as Dr. Logan said, that and what I mentioned earlier is that my tribe is originally from Kansas, and he was talking about a festival that is held every year in a little town called Council Grove. It's kind of in the middle of Kansas. And that is the last place that my tribe lived before they were moved to Oklahoma. And so several years ago, that little town of Council Grove, Kansas would invite my tribe to come back for a weekend, just a way to kind of remind everyone that that was our homeland. And so we were, in some ways, we were kind of guests in our former homeland, but it wasn't our home anymore because we were moved to Oklahoma. And it was kind of interesting. Back when I used to work for my tribe years ago. I was the historic preservation officer for my people. And there was a landowner in Council Grove. He owned a ranch, and he was considering selling part of the ranch and giving part of the ranch to the tribe, to my tribe. And so it was a little ironic that when we would come up and visit for that one weekend out of the year, we were welcomed by the townsfolk. They'd have a big parade for us and kind of put us on display, and we do some tribal dances for everybody. But as soon as they found out we were thinking about acquiring land back in Council Grove, then a lot of some of this negativity started to swell up from the community. Is this tribe really coming back to Oklahoma, or from Oklahoma to Kansas? And are they going to build a casino now? And are they going to bring all their problems, their drugs, and all these other things to Kansas? And so I realized then that we had some education to do there. And I'm a little jealous of Polly and Charlotte, because they're in their ancestral homelands. And for us, we were removed from our homelands in 1872, along with many other tribes from around the country. And I don't know if you know this or not, but What happened in Oklahoma, here in Oklahoma, was the equivalent of moving every single country in Europe to a place the size of England, not necessarily in terms of population, but in terms of diversity of languages, cultures, cultural lifeways. And so think about these 39 tribal nations being forced into this place the size of Oklahoma when we were from all over the United States. And then we were all expected to get along and understand each other, but many different languages and many different cultures. Tribes here come from as far as California, from the Great Lakes area, from the Gulf of Mexico, all the way to the East Coast, New York State. So a very diverse group of people put into a very small place, and then the pressures of colonialism, more people coming into our new homeland. So we had to adapt ways. We were no longer connected to our ancestral lands, places where a lot of our ceremonies took place, areas that we were familiar with. So we had to reinvent new traditions in a new land, but we also brought our traditions with us, and we call that moving fires. Our fires moved along with us. We carried the embers of our fires and started new fires here in Oklahoma to continue those traditions. And there are over 570 federally recognized tribes in the United States. But I don't know if you know this or not, there are only 39 tribes in Oklahoma, but those 39 tribes represent more than 60% of all American Indians throughout the United States. In fact, 50% of all American Indians are members of 4 tribes, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Muscogee Creek and Seminole, and those tribes are here in Oklahoma. So Oklahoma was a foreign land, but we've made it our own now, and we found ways to connect to each other, even though all of our tribes have many differences in cultures and languages. In fact, powwow culture evolved here in Oklahoma, intertribal gatherings, so that we could find things in common with each other. And of course, the biggest thing we had in common was the suppression and subjugation by our federal government, and that certainly has united us today here in Oklahoma.
Absolutely. It saddens me to think about the immense amount of wrongs that were done to Native people, but it also gives me a chance to understand the plight and understand how to work against the erasure of peoples. And as you're speaking, I wanted to ask you a follow-up question, something on the backs of just being in Oklahoma and having that now be ancestral land and where you reside, and now building a museum, First Americans Museum. So how do you believe that your identities shape the way that you make decisions now at First Americans Museum?
Well, the First Americans Museum, it's a new museum. We're going to open next September 18th to be exact. So everyone on this Zoom conference is invited to come to the opening in next September. But our museum, we're not here to tell every single story of every single tribe in Oklahoma, but we're going to tell the collective histories of the tribes, meaning the circumstances that brought all the tribes to Oklahoma. And a lot of the, it's not a fun story to hear, but we're going to tell those stories from our perspective. And history was not written, our history was not written by us, it was written by others. And so this museum is an opportunity on a large scale for the 39 tribes to tell our histories, our collective histories, from our perspective, from the first person perspective. When you go to many museums that present American Indian history or Native American history, you're hearing a filtered version, or you're experiencing an interpretation of what people think American Indian or Native American history is. But I'm proud to say at the First Americans Museum, I have an all-Native curatorial team. Everyone that works here is a member of a tribe from Oklahoma. When I was helping to develop the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., only 9% of the staff were American Indians. So I think we're going to bring a level of authenticity to our project, and we're going to be telling a truth or truths from another perspective, and the things that you've learned in school and the perceptions that people have aren't necessarily the way things happen from our perspective. So I think we balance things out here at the First Americans Museum. We have another museum here in Oklahoma City, the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum. That museum tells the white or the colonial history of this part of the country, and we need to balance that out and be able to tell our stories from our perspective. And so I've learned over the years and working in museums, there's not just one truth, there are many truths depending on the perspective that you're coming from. And that's why I think it's so important for other cultures and other communities to have a voice in the museum field and to be represented in the telling of these histories and these stories rather than just having one perspective.
Absolutely. And representation is so important, as you've iterated to us. It breeds access. It breeds a way for folks to feel empowered and to increase self-efficacy in the way that they engage with museums. So I'm just delighted that you were able to hire so many Native folks to work with their history, heritage, and culture within the First Museums or First Americans Museum.
And I'd like to add, this could not have happened 20 years ago because there were very few Native Americans working in the museum field. So a lot has changed over the last 20 years, and now more Native Americans are feeling comfortable going into the museum field and helping to make those changes and make a difference.
Yeah, that is amazing. That is absolutely amazing. And I'm excited for the opening, and I'm excited for what is to come with the museum. This next question is following up the understanding of representation and what it means for access. And especially during a time like 2020, when we're facing twin pandemics with COVID and systemic racism. So the question for Lisa, what does access mean to you moving forward, given the current context of museum education, COVID-19, and anti-racism?
Right. Well, thank you for that question. And just I'm so inspired by the conversation. And I was looking at the chat, and not surprisingly, there are a couple of questions about how we move forward still with COVID or eventually post-COVID in the educational landscape of resources. And I actually have a program called Access at Berkeley. So the acronym is Advancing Community College Education and Student Success. So it started very much as an in-person program where community colleges in the Bay Area, classes in either geoscience or biology would spend an afternoon at the museum with a guided lab, guided by graduate students at the UC Museum of Paleontology. And so our whole goal was not only to better connect with the two-year colleges in the area, but we know that sometimes two-year college students don't get that direct access to museum, to a research university, to that kind of hands-on connection with students who are somewhat older than them, but who can also connect because they might be first generation or from a family who didn't have the income to go right away to a four-year college. But I give you that example because now that we've had to transition to the virtual space, the graduate students who were leading the in-person tours have now created a whole suite, more than a dozen virtual labs that highlight the importance of some of those same fossils, from dinosaurs to fossil crabs. There are some amazing virtual images, not just from our own museums, but there are several platforms where paleontologists upload their 3D images. And so students can manipulate those and answer questions much in the same way that we would pose them before. And it's going so great. We're able to expand it and get additional funding. And for younger groups of students, so we're continuing to build out our online resources, the value of virtual field trips, conversations with scientists, profiles, case studies of paleontologists who do work in locations that may be near where these students live, and also profiling scientists who come from the communities we want to serve is especially important as well. And we know that virtual learning is here to stay, you know, for better or for worse. And I think for accessibility and inclusion, it does play an important role. But we were fortunate last year to receive a multi-year grant from the National Institutes of Health. And the goal in this funding is to develop a pop-up museum where one will experience evolution education in the context of an escape room style game. And so one of our popular websites is Understanding Evolution. It's really a go-to source of trusted information about teaching and learning about biological evolution. And I've long been concerned that we're still missing communities. We're missing rural communities. We're missing communities that are in states where it's frankly still really difficult, you know, for teachers to highlight that subject. So with this pop-up, that it's fully inflatable, deflatable, and we'll be able to send it off to a number of locations. And we have a number of museum and library partners in rural areas. And the game will center around, go figure, the outbreak of a virus. And we conceived this all pre-COVID, and it won't be a virus that completely infects the human population. It's in reptiles and amphibians. So anyway, but with this game, the users, which can be families, they can be school kids, they'll be asked to put on their scientist hat and figure out why and how this virus is so different from something else. And so they have to then solve, you know, where this virus fits on the evolutionary tree so that they can develop a serum. And the way that we envision this game, you know, does it's at its best when people can participate in person, but we have some virtual strands of it as well. But those are the kinds of things we're working on, where we want to bring the museum to people no matter where they live, and not expect that they come to us or only experience information about paleontology and evolution from websites. So I think more of those portable experiences that you can take, you know, to a farmer's market or a small school, a library, you know, or even a church gathering is something we look forward to doing.
That is inspiring. It is very inspiring that to know that you create opportunities for access through access.
Right.
And you make it fun.
We try.
That's one beautiful piece of informal education is we get all the fun parts. We don't have the testing. We don't have the parts that, you know, students normally are adverse to, but we have the fun parts of it, right? And I think, speaking of fun, I don't want to be the only one to ask you all questions. So I know that we got some audience members that definitely have some questions that are written in the chat. If you all are open to it, I am definitely wanting to ask these questions to both of you to see, you know, your answers to those. I think they're some pretty pertinent questions that are in the chat. First question of which looks like it's for Jim. It says, what are the best ways you've seen museums, especially education departments, approach preserving traditional ways of knowing to encourage children's engagement with STEAM education and culture?
That's a great question. And I'm excited to say we've been working on that here and developing a wonderful, what we call a family discovery center. It's not just for kids, but in many cultures, especially Native American culture, a lot of that cultural knowledge is passed on from generation to generation. There's intergenerational transference of knowledge. And a lot of times it's the grandparents and the grandkids, because the parents are away at work during the day. And again, this happens in a lot of cultures. And so we feel it's really important not just to engage youth, but engage the entire family and get the family working and creating together and learning together. And so we developed an entire space, about 6,500 square feet of space, to engage families and get them collaborating together and get them sharing experiences together in that space. So that's one way we're doing that. I know another question is, you know, how are we, how's our educational department in the museum? How are we going to provide these programs and services. And I've always been an advocate in the museum field. First, before you bring the public into the museum, with all the great programs and services that museums offer, especially in the educational side of things, that you've got to educate the educators. And we spend a lot of time working with teachers in the different school districts in our area to prepare them for not only the visits with school kids coming to our museum, and they may get one visit in their lifetime while they're in school to come to our museum, but we develop lesson plans and curriculum for them that they can teach in the schools. And so the museum experience enhances that, enhances the learning and teaching materials that they already have. So we will invite teachers and educators to come to our facility, but we'll also go out to the schools to be able to inform and teach the teachers, because a lot of the teachers don't understand the content or not familiar with it. And so we need to educate them in that regard too. So those are some of the ways that we kind of prepare for those activities. And then when we do have visits here at the facility, it certainly enhances the visits, and the teachers have already prepared the kids for that and given them some of that knowledge. And then with regard to outreach, I've worked in several different museums. One in particular, the Gilcrease Museum in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We actually had a program called Gilcrease on Wheels, which was a van that we packed with educational materials, not unlike what Lisa was talking about. And we would go to rural communities, because rural communities either just didn't have the resources or they were too far away to come visit our facility. So we would take our facility to those rural areas and set up programs and demonstrations there at the schools to get them excited about that. So, but I am a huge advocate, and you've got to educate the educators as part of the mission of the museum.
Absolutely. And you hit on something I think the next question is going to lead us into. You talked about decentralization with the van that was able to go to rural communities to be able to continue doing the work that you want to do through the museums. So this next question is from Andrea. And Andrea says, what are some of the key ways museums can address racial and social justice issues through informal education programs? The question is for both of you.
Great. Well, I'll start, and certainly want to support what Jim was saying of how interconnected the kinds of education opportunities that we seek to offer from a museum. So investing in teachers, investing in families and communities, and coming from a central philosophy that it's possible to learn really anywhere. And if you create situations where individuals can learn as they go, there's no judgment about what knowledge base they might come to you with. You can just excite them about learning, because that's half of what we want to do. More than half is inspire, motivate, have students and families see maybe part of themselves in the things that we do. And I've been participating in many discussions with fellow earth scientists about how to really infuse that sense of justice and accessibility and inclusiveness in a science that is deep time. So many of the objects, many of the topics that we consider, predate human history, and maybe students don't always feel really connected, even though they might love dinosaurs. A lot of times families are pressured really when their youth go off to college to select a science or select even a discipline that the family may see as one that leads to a job. And so if we're having that conversation, earth science and paleontology is usually not on that list. But there are so many ways we're trying to re-engage communities around understanding the earth. I mean, think about the kinds of stresses and just environmental change at the extreme that all of the states we live in are dealing with now. And that's our field. I mean, geoscience, understanding climate of the past, there's so much informing the future of studying the past that is really helpful for modeling, current climate. And so we engage youth around those topics that, the science can really be for you, and look at the communities where many of families and communities of color live. They are the most challenged environmentally, and the knowledge that we gain as our scientists from talking to traditional scientists, the ecological knowledge that comes from generations of people that have existed on lands that are changing rapidly. So you can have all of the, Google Earth imagery and mapping and spatial tools that you want, but if you fail to ask a person on the ground who's lived there about what kind of change they see, then we're never going to fully, understand our science. So engaging communities that we want to better serve around those topics that, we need input, we need citizens, we need youth who care about these kinds of environmental topics to join us in this work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Jim, did you want to take a shot at it?
Sure. Well, our museum already is a lightning rod for social justice issues. And one of the things we've been working on even before we opened the museum is the perception of the land here and the history here. And I remember a few years ago, the previous governor at her inauguration gave a speech about the pioneers coming to a barren land and taming the land here in Oklahoma. And this was in the 1880s. And my mouth just dropped because there were tens of thousands of people living here before the arrival of European settlers. And in the school districts here around us, in probably about the 5th or 6th grade, they would have these land run reenactments. You've all seen the play Oklahoma. Well, it's about the Sooners, or they opened up native land that was set aside for natives in perpetuity for white settlement. And there was a land run or a rush to come in and claim this land, again, that was set aside for Native Americans. And so they would have these land run reenactments in grade schools in our area. And of course, this is probably one of the darkest parts of our history here in Oklahoma, because it was the displacement of one group of people to make room for the colonization of another group of people. And so we've been working hard to stop those land run reenactments in the school districts here, and we've been successful with that. And really trying to let people know that and educate people that there's more than one side to history, and there's ramifications for things that happen within our history. So, but we do take a stand on certain issues here, obviously that pertain to our mission, which is to educate the broader public about the histories and the contributions and cultural lifeways of the tribes here in Oklahoma. But we also need to be neutral in a certain way so that we can facilitate the dialogue. And I see our museum as a venue for civic engagement so that we can bring multiple perspectives into a forum or a safe, as we would say, a safe place for unsafe ideas, so that we can have these discussions here at our museum and talk about some of these particular issues that are pertinent to not only Native Americans, but to broader society. So we certainly want to facilitate that dialogue through a variety of programs that we have here at the museum, but every once in a while we will kind of remind people about things. In fact, Halloween is coming up this coming weekend, and we just kind of started our social media campaign to get people familiar with our museum as we lead up to the opening. And one of the things that you'll see a post on our Instagram at First Americans Museum, or FAMOK Museum on Instagram, is that later in the week, we're going to remind people that it's not okay to dress up in someone else's culture, appropriate someone else's culture for Halloween. And so we're going to send a little message out about that. But in general, we try to be that neutral venue for civic engagement, to have that dialogue about these tough issues.
Perfect, right? I mean, just a chance to bring folks into the conversation and to help enlighten, right? The point of information is be able to access it and do something with it, right? And meaningfully inspire change for the better in our society. So we've just do a time check. We got about 4 more minutes here, and I want to ask one more question to you both. This one is from Susan, and Susan writes, wondering what you think of the role of this kind of virtual education when COVID is behind us. So essentially, what will we do with virtual education once we've surpassed COVID and we've gotten over this pandemic?
Well, it's definitely here to stay. I mean, despite how many of us feel about it, and I think I was in denial for a while, but look at, I guess, the positives, right? Think of how many more communities we're connected with now that can be easier to connect with, as a result of the virtual space and just the ability to share more things, broadly and widely. And in the case of the University of California Museum of Paleontology, because so much of our outreach was a virtual footprint, because we are primarily a research museum, then we find ourselves now, being even more creative about the virtual sharing, recognizing that we just need to reinvest because it's somewhat here to stay. But counter to that, we can't wait to get back out and invite people for some of the programs that I mentioned, like the Access Paleo program. So we certainly want to complement the in-person programs that we intend to do or return to, with all of the virtual learning resources that can serve, as a way to get people prepared before they come to the museum and also afterwards. But there are plenty of virtual communities now that I think are really enjoying, the kinds of conversations that we're having now, and I can see those staying. And I'm hoping that some of the mentoring that I've been doing, I noticed there was a question about just how can we get more Black, Indigenous, and people of color, our early career, our college students, and those who may not consider an education trajectory or career option, how can we encourage them to consider museum education? And I think it goes both ways. I think plenty of young people of color would love to work in a museum, but sometimes we don't present, the most inclusive face. And of course, that's why we're all here. We want them to know that, we intend to serve diverse communities better, but we've got to look inward, I think, at some things we can do to attract those to our profession and make folks feel more welcome, and that it is a possible, career option. And so perhaps through internships and, different kinds of collaborative programs where we encourage that kinds of direct experience and knowing how museums work can be part of it.
Absolutely. Jim, you want to give us a short answer? We got about a minute or so left.
Sure. And I'm looking at all the great questions that people are sending us, and unfortunately, we won't get to all of them. But to answer this question, I've been involved in distance learning even before COVID hit. I've worked in places where we've connected to rural communities, especially in Alaska. Many of the native communities are very isolated, and even here in the lower 48 and throughout the Southwest, many of our tribes are very isolated. And so through the Gates Foundation and others, we had set up some distance learning programs. But the biggest challenge that we have, especially in rural areas, is the access to broadband. So even though we're in the age of COVID now and post-COVID, there's going to be a lot of virtual educational programs. A lot of communities don't have access to the broadband to be able to do that. And so one of the things I've been working with is local and regional businesses and tribes to bring the broadband to rural communities so that we can have access to that distance learning. And so setting up cell towers, in fact, in my own tribe, we're setting up cell towers on our land to be able to bring high-speed internet to rural areas. Right now, it's very slow if you have it at all. And so I'm a big advocate for that, getting the broadband out to communities so that we can have distance learning and virtual learning.
Absolutely. And so I just want to take a second and thank both Jim and Lisa for explicating your experiences and really letting us into a snippet of what you do on a daily basis, progressing towards the mission of preserving culture, heritage, and our history. So if everybody would join me in thanking Jim and Lisa.
I can hear it virtually.
Thank you. My pleasure.
So as you can see, the experiences described by Jim and Lisa are ones that we at the Burke Museum labor to duplicate for our youth. Whether school groups, learning pods, or a family unit that is never engaged with museums as learning spaces, we are here for you. Those in the audience who have not had a chance to experience the magic at the Burke, especially those that teach or engage with our youth, I say to you the famous words of Albert Einstein: in the middle of difficulty lies opportunity. As we know, 2020 has been a very difficult year, but the Burke will always offer the opportunity for you to learn and to love doing it. So thank you again to Jim and Lisa, and thanks to everyone for supporting the empowering work that we are doing in the education department at the Burke. I would now like to turn it back over to Polly for a few closing words.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us today and raising funds for the Burke's education programs to get out to our communities. The link to give is in the chat again, if you'd still like to make a gift. We are so grateful to each of you for joining us. Our education programs will definitely change the narrative for Indigenous peoples and the future generations and create strong scientists as they become engaged in museum education. In closing, I would like to thank the ancestors for giving us the stories, the strength, and resilience to be present and share in witnessing these stories today. Together, we will make a difference for future generations and create positive, strong leaders. Thank you for joining us.